All right, this week, Senator Ted Cruz and House Speaker Mike Johnson, Congressman Chip Roy, and a host of others from both the House and the Senate filed an amicus brief. That's a friend of the court brief. They did so at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in regard to laws requiring displays of the Ten Commandments in public schools, both in Texas and Louisiana. Now, these laws, as you can imagine, have received significant pushback from the left. The left, by the way, which is perfectly fine with rainbow flags in the classrooms and that sort of thing, but not a document that actually has historical significance in our country. But nonetheless, why is this case right now so important? Well, here now to share more is Mike Berry. He's the Executive Director of External Affairs and Senior Counsel at First Liberty Institute, which filed the brief on behalf of these members of Congress. Mike, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to have you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
Well, let's start with maybe a little refresher course on this. Tell us about the Texas and Louisiana laws, and then what these members of Congress are actually pointing out.
Well, this goes back to several years ago. First Liberty Institute won a number of cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. We first won the case of the American Legion versus the American Humanist Association, which of course was our successful defense of a World War I Veterans Memorial. And then just a few years ago, we won the now famous case of Coach Joe Kennedy in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. Those two cases are important because they really turned about 50 years of bad Supreme Court precedent on its head and got rid of what's known as the lemon test, which is what the left has been using for half a century to do things like try to attack Ten Commandments in schoolhouses or on state capitol grounds or other government buildings. And so the Supreme Court said, look, when you have something that has some sort of religious significance or as well as historical significance on government property, it's no longer appropriate to remove it just because somebody says they're offended. We need to look to the history and tradition of the country to see whether that display, whether it's a Ten Commandments, a nativity scene, or something like that, a Veterans Memorial that's in the shape of a cross, is there some sort of historical significance to that that is consistent with the history and tradition of America and our Constitution? In the case of a Ten Commandments in a schoolhouse, we had two states, Texas and Louisiana, that passed laws through their legislatures saying, yes, it's perfectly acceptable to have Ten Commandments put up in a schoolhouse or in a schoolroom, and that's what the state legislatures did. The governor signed it into law. And like you said, Jody, unfortunately, you've got activists on the left who immediately filed lawsuits to try to challenge it. And now we are at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals fighting for those. And we had 46 members of Congress from both chambers, the Senate and the House, led by Senator Ted Cruz, Speaker Mike Johnson, Congressman Chip Roy, saying, look, this is entirely consistent with the history and tradition of the nation and the Constitution to do this. And so we're very proud to stand with those senators and representatives in upholding these laws.
All right, so what about those who start screaming, separation of church and state? Does that hold any water in this case whatsoever?
No. I mean, the words separation of church and state, first of all, are found nowhere in our Constitution. Second of all, that's the sort of religious hostility that the Supreme Court tossed out when they issued those decisions in those two cases that I talked about that First Liberty won. So that's no longer the law of the land in this country. It was for about 50 years where all you had to do was say separation of church and state. I'm offended to see a Ten Commandments in a schoolroom, and you would get a liberal activist judge who would rule in their favor. They can't do that anymore because of those two cases. So now at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's our hope, is that the judges on the Fifth Circuit will take those two Supreme Court victories that First Liberty won. They'll look at these two state laws that were passed in Texas and Louisiana, and they'll say enough is enough, right? It is wholly appropriate and consistent with the Constitution to have a Ten Commandments in a schoolroom, in a city hall, courtroom chambers. For goodness sakes, we've got the Ten Commandments inscribed up on the ceiling of the Supreme Court itself, the Supreme Court of the United States. So why wouldn't we have it in a schoolroom?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, there's copies of displays of the Ten Commandments even there in the Supreme Court. How did they then say, well, we can have it, but you can't? I mean, are these cases very different from that which the Supreme Court itself has?
Well, there's certainly a lot of similarities, Jody, but one of the differences is that these two cases out of Texas and Louisiana, they really arise out of acts of the state legislature. And so that's why I think this amicus brief, this friend of the court brief, as you mentioned, is really important here, is because it really boils down to, can a state legislature pass a law that does something like this without being challenged immediately just because somebody says they're offended? Because as our brief points out, if all it takes is for somebody to say they're offended, then any time a state legislature tries to pass a law, and I realize you're a former member of Congress yourself, so you probably understand this as well as anyone, that members of Congress and in the state legislature are going to have to look over their shoulder anytime they pass a law and start wondering, well, gosh, is somebody going to be offended by what we've just done and try to sue us and undo all this hard work? Legislatures would never get anything done, and all it would take was be an activist judge to strike down a duly enacted piece of legislation. We can't have that in this country, or nothing will ever get accomplished.
Absolutely. Extremely well said. Thank you so much, Mike Berry, First Liberty Institute. Always great to have you, my friend.
Thanks for having me on.